My father mailed my wedding invitation back to me. He didn't call. He didn't write a letter. He took the cream envelope I had addressed in my own hand, and across the front of the invitation, in the heavy black ink he used for signing checks, he wrote one word: declined. That was all. I stood in the post office in Wexford, Ohio, and I read it twice. I did not cry. I drove home, and I bought a frame, and I hung it on the wall. A week before that, at the engagement dinner, in front of nearly 40 relatives, my father stood up with his glass in his hand. He looked at the man I loved, and he said, "No Ashford marries a man who crawls under other people's furnaces." That same week, they revoked my college trust. They struck my name from the founding roll of the family store. Clean off, like I had never been born into it. The morning after they emptied the account with my name on it, I made one phone call. Not to a lawyer, to a real estate broker. If anyone ever told you that you'd be nothing without them, this story is for you. My name is Nora, and I want you to stay with me to the end of this one, because the ending is not the one they planned for me. If this is the kind of story you needed today, subscribe and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Tell me where you are. Then come back and sit with me, because I have to take you back to the beginning, to a girl who still believed she belonged. I was 18, and I loved them. You have to understand that first, or none of the rest will land the way it should. I loved my family. I loved the store. Ashford and Vale sat on the corner of Main and 3rd in downtown Wexford, 4 stories of brick and brass, and I grew up inside it the way other children grow up inside a house. I knew the smell of the perfume counter on the ground floor. I knew the sound the old freight elevator made when it caught. I knew which stair on the back staircase creaked, and I used to skip it on purpose, a small private game, every single day. My grandfather built that store. Silas Ashford. He came back from the war with nothing but a strong back and a partner named Vale, who put up half the money and died young, and Silas bought him out and kept the name anyway, out of loyalty. I never met a man who understood loyalty the way my grandfather did. He had hands like tree bark. He used to let me sit on the counter by the register when I was small, and he'd hold up his palms. And he'd say, "Nora, these hands built this, not money." Hands. He believed in honest work the way some men believe in God. My father believed in the ledger. That was the difference between them, and I was too young to see how wide that difference was. Gerald Ashford ran the store after my grandfather got old, and he was good at it. I won't pretend he wasn't. The numbers were always clean. The floors always shown. But where my grandfather saw people, my father saw columns, assets and liabilities, and somewhere along the way, without ever saying it out loud, my father had decided that I was an asset. The Ashford daughter, groomed for the store, groomed for a good marriage, groomed to keep the name climbing. My mother, Vivian, she was the one who did the grooming. She measured the world in weddings. She could look at a family across a church and tell you they're standing down to the dollar. And she had a plan for me, and the plan did not include a man who came to fix the boiler. That's how I met Mateo. It was February, and the store's old boiler died in the middle of the coldest week of the year. The whole building went cold. Customers kept their coats on. My father was furious, because a cold store is an empty store, and an empty store is a bad column. So he called a company, and the company sent a young vac tech named Mateo Reyes, and I happened to be standing in the basement when he came down the stairs with his tool bag over his shoulder. He didn't know who I was. That was the thing. Everyone in that building knew who I was. The staff called me Miss Ashford. The sales lady straightened when I passed. But Mateo just looked at me, this girl standing in a cold basement, and he said, "You're going to want to step back. It's about to get loud down here." And he grinned. And I stepped back. He worked for 3 hours on that boiler. I should have gone upstairs. I didn't. I sat on an overturned crate and I watched him work, and I asked him questions, and he answered every one like it was a good question. Nobody in my life answered my questions like they were good questions. When the boiler finally kicked, the whole basement shuddered and the heat came up. And he wiped his hands on a rag and he looked at me and he said, "There, now nobody freezes. Not now the store makes money. Now nobody freezes." He was thinking about the sales ladies in their thin cardigans. He was thinking about the old man who ran the elevator. I thought about my grandfather's hands. I know how this sounds. A rich girl and the repairman. I've heard every version of the joke. But it wasn't a joke to me, and it wasn't a rescue, and it wasn't rebellion. It was the first time in 18 years that someone looked at me and saw a person instead of a plan. We talked for a year before I ever told my parents his name. A whole year. I'd meet him after his shifts. We'd sit in his truck outside a diner on the edge of town, drinking bad coffee, and he'd tell me about the trade, about pipes and pressure and the way a good system breathes. And I'd tell him about the store, about my grandfather, about the founding role with our name at the top. He listened to all of it. He never once asked me what I'd inherit. When I finally brought him home, my mother smiled the whole evening. That was how I knew it was bad. Vivian Ashford's warmest smile was the one she used on people she had already decided to erase. The erasing started quietly. It always does. The first thing they did, I almost didn't notice. Every Christmas the store put up a plaque in the front lobby, brass, engraved with the names of the family. It went back decades. My grandfather's name, my father's, my mother's, my brother Preston's, and mine. I'd watch them add my name when I turned 16, and I remember how proud I was, seeing it there in the brass, my name in the same metal as my grandfather's, Nora Ashford. That December, I walked into the lobby, and my name was gone. They'd had a new plaque cut, same brass, same font, every name but mine, and it was hung so cleanly, so exactly where the old one had been, that a stranger would never have known anything was missing. Only I knew. I stood there in my coat with shoppers moving all around me, and I stared at the empty space where I used to be. And I felt something cold go through me that had nothing to do with the weather. That same week, a small package came in the mail. No note, no return address in her hand, though I knew her hand. Inside was my childhood house key, the one I'd carried since I was 10. She'd had the locks changed, and she mailed me the old key like you'd return something to a stranger who'd left it behind. No word, just the key, cold in a padded envelope. That was my mother telling me I no longer lived in the world I was born in. She didn't have the courage to say it. She let a brass plaque and a dead key say it for her. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. I actually told myself that. When you love people, you'll invent whole reasons to keep believing they love you back. I thought, they're upset, they'll come around, Mateo will win them over, they just need time. I still believed I could earn my way back in. That was my blind spot, and it would take me years to see it. I kept knocking on a door that had already been bricked over. The second offense was bigger, and this time there was a witness. My father called me to the store, to his office on the 4th floor, the one with the tall windows that looked down on Main Street. I was so hopeful walking up those stairs. I skipped the creaky one out of old habit. I thought maybe this was the reconciliation. Maybe he wanted to talk about the wedding. The bookkeeper was already in there. Old Mr. Hollis, who'd kept the store's books since before I was born. He was sitting off to the side with a folder in his lap, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. And that was the first sign. My father didn't ask me to sit. He stood behind his desk and he told me, in the same voice he used to discuss inventory, that my college trust was being dissolved. The money my grandfather had set aside for my education, gone, folded back into the general accounts. You've made your choices, he said. The trust was for an Ashford's future. You've chosen a different one. Then he slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a copy of the founding roll, the document my grandfather signed the day the store opened, with the family names to be carried forward. And my name had a line through it. A single black line. He'd done it himself. He wanted me to see it done. I didn't beg. I want you to know that. Something in me, even then, refused to beg. But I was breaking, and I think he could see it, and I think he liked it. It was Mr. Hollis who saved that meeting from being the worst thing that had happened to me, though none of us knew it at the time. As I stood to leave, my father took a phone call, and old Hollis walked me to the door, and he was flustered, trying to fill the terrible silence, the way kind people do around cruelty they can't stop. And he said something. He said it like an apology, like small talk, like nothing at all. He said, "You know, it's a strange thing about this building." He nodded at the walls around us. "Your family doesn't even own it. Your grandfather sold it back in '84. Sold the building, leased it right back. Always meaning to buy it again when times were good. Never did. Times were always about to be good." He gave a sad little laugh. Funny, the things a family means to do and never does. And then my father hung up the phone, and Hollis went quiet, and I walked out. I forgot it almost immediately. That's the truth. My name had just been crossed off my own bloodline with a pen, and an old man's remark about a lease from 1984 didn't stand a chance in my memory. I threw it away. I threw away the single most important sentence anyone would ever say to me. I want you to remember that Hollis said it, because I didn't. Not for a long time. Then came the dinner. The engagement dinner was my mother's idea, which should have warned me. She insisted on it. She said the family should meet Mateo properly. All of them. And I was so starved for a sign that they were coming around that I said yes. I let myself hope. Mateo didn't want to go. He looked at me across his little kitchen table, and he said, "Nora, those people don't want to meet me. They want an audience." And I told him he was wrong. I told him my family were good people who were scared, and that once they saw him, really saw him, they'd understand. He wore his one good suit. He'd bought it for the occasion, and it didn't fit him perfectly, and I remember he kept tugging at the cuffs in the car. This proud man, this man who could take apart a failing system and make it breathe, nervous over a jacket. I loved him so much in that moment I could barely speak. There were nearly 40 of them at the country club. Aunts and uncles and cousins, my brother Preston with that easy golden smile, my mother in silver, my father at the head of a long table under a chandelier. And I understood the moment we walked in that Mateo had been right. It wasn't a dinner. It was a courtroom, and it was a stage, and we were both. They were polite for a while. That was the cruelty of it. They let us sit down. They let the salads come. My cousins asked Mateo careful little questions, and every question was a trap dressed as manners. And what is it you do, exactly? And is there much of a future in that? Oh, you fix furnaces. How useful. Every word had a hook in it. Mateo answered all of them with his back straight. He didn't flinch. He was better than every person at that table, and they were working very hard to make him feel like less, and he simply would not be made to feel it. I was so proud of him, and I was so ashamed of them, and those two feelings were tearing me in half. Then my father stood up. He had his wine glass in his hand. The room went quiet the way a room goes quiet when the most powerful man in it stands, and everyone turned, and I felt my stomach drop, because I knew that stance. I'd seen him give toasts my whole life, and he looked down the length of that table, past all his relatives, and he looked at Mateo, and he did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. That was the worst part. He said, "I've thought a great deal about what to say tonight, so I'll be plain. This family has a name that took 3 generations to build, and no Ashford marries a man who crawls under other people's furnaces." Nobody gasped. That's what I remember. I keep waiting, in the memory, for someone to gasp, for one aunt to say, "Gerald, please." Nobody did. 40 faces, and not one of them moved to stop it. Some of them looked down at their plates. A few of them, I saw it. A few of them almost smiled. My mother watched me with those calm architect's eyes to see how the structure would hold. Mateo started to stand. He was going to say something, take it on himself, protect me the way he always tried to. And I put my hand on his arm. And I stood up instead. I didn't shout. I want you to hear that, because it matters to everything that came after. I did not give them the scene they were dressed up to watch. I stood, and I set my napkin on the table, folded, and I looked at my father, and my voice came out steadier than I've ever been in my life. I said, "His name is Mateo. He fixed the boiler in your store so your employees wouldn't freeze. You were happy enough to be warm." And then I said, "Thank you for the dinner." That was all. Thank you for the dinner. And I took Mateo's hand, and we walked out under the chandelier, past 40 silent Ashfords, and I did not let them see me cry until we were in the truck. The invitation came back 4 days later, declined, in his hand. I kept the card. I don't fully know why, in that first raw week. It was a wound with a stamp on it. But I couldn't throw it away. Some part of me knew I would need it someday, the way you keep the X-ray of the bone that broke. I slid it into a drawer, and I closed the drawer, and I married Mateo Reyes on a Saturday in a courthouse with 2 witnesses we'd known for a month and a bouquet from a grocery store. It was the best day of my life. I need you to know that too. They thought they were sending me into the cold. And I married the only person who had ever kept me warm. That night, in the little apartment over a laundromat that was all we could afford, Mateo made me a promise. We were lying in the dark, and I was still shaking a little. The way you do after you've cut something out of your body that had been growing there your whole life. And he took my hand, and he pressed it flat against his chest, and he said, "Nora, I don't have their money. I know that, but I've got these." He meant his hands. "And I swear to you, I am going to build you something they can never take away. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to build it. You watch me. You watch me." Hold on to that. It's an open loop, and it takes 10 years to close. And when it closes hard. Now I have to move fast, because a decade goes by, and I can't give you every day of it, and you wouldn't want them all. But I have to give you the ones that count. The choices. Because that's what a rebuilt life actually is. It isn't a montage. It's 100 small, brutal decisions, each one with a price, and I'm going to walk you through the 6 that changed everything. Here are the first ones. The first choice was school. Not the college they took from me. I couldn't afford that, and I was done wanting what they'd taken. I chose something they'd have laughed at. I cleaned offices at night, downtown Wexford, mopping the floors of buildings owned by men who'd sat at that dinner table. And after my shift, at 11 at night, exhausted, smelling of industrial cleaner, I drove to a strip mall, where a community college ran real estate licensing courses in a rented room, 2 nights a week. Then, 3. I sat in the back and I learned about deeds and titles and leases and easements. I learned the words that rich men use to keep what they have. And I was so tired that I fell asleep at red lights, and Mateo would call me on the drive home just to keep me awake. And we couldn't afford the phone minutes, and we did it anyway. The cost of that first choice was time, and pride, and my hands. I had soft hands when I was in Ashford. I didn't anymore. But I passed the exam on the first try. I got my license. And I framed nothing that year, but I remember holding that little license card and thinking, this is mine. Nobody signed it for me. Nobody can cross it out. The second choice was the duplex. It was a wreck. A foreclosed duplex on the east side of Wexford, water damage, a caved-in porch, a price so low, it scared me. We'd saved for 2 years. Every dollar. And to buy it meant every dollar was gone, and if it went wrong we had nothing, and we'd be back to zero with nothing to show. Mateo walked through it with a flashlight, and he didn't say it was a good deal. He said, I can fix all of this. The bones are good. Bad systems, good bones. Bones again. He always saw the bones. We bought it. And for 8 months we lived in half of it while he rebuilt the other half with his own hands after his day job, and I did the books, and pulled the permits and learned the other half of the business, the paper half. He taught me to swing a hammer. I taught myself to read a settlement statement. We sold that duplex for a profit that felt, to us, like winning a lottery. It wasn't much. To an Ashford, it would have been a rounding error. To us, it was proof. The first real proof that the thing Mateo swore in the dark was actually possible. That we could take something broken and cheap and make it worth more than anyone thought. That became the whole idea of our lives. The third choice nearly ended us before we started, and it taught me the thing about my family I'd been refusing to learn. We wanted to do a bigger project, a real one, 3 houses at once. And for that, we needed a loan, a spa loan. And for that loan, the bank wanted a cosigner, because we had a short history and no cushion. And I did something I swore I'd never do. I asked my family. I didn't ask my father. I wasn't a fool. I asked my brother. Preston, the golden child who'd always been softer than the rest, who used to sneak me candy when we were kids. I called him, and I hated the sound of my own voice asking, and I laid it out plain. Just a signature. Not money. A signature, on paper, saying you believe your sister will pay her debts. And there was a long silence on the phone. And then Preston said, gently, almost kindly, which made it worse, Nora, you know I can't. Dad would. It's just not something I can put my name on. Dad would. Even Preston, 30 years old, running the flagship store, couldn't put his name next to mine without our father's permission. That was the day I stopped asking. Right there, on that phone call. Something in me finally understood what Mateo had known at the dinner. You cannot earn your way back to people who have decided you don't count. There is no signature good enough, no success big enough, no apology humble enough. The door isn't locked. The door is bricked over. And I had been standing in front of it for years with my knuckles bleeding, so I stopped knocking. And it was the freest I had ever felt. We got the loan anyway. It took another year. We found a co-signer, and here's the thing. It wasn't family, it wasn't anyone who owed us anything. It was Ruth Okafor. Ruth was a commercial broker I'd met at a title company, a woman who'd built her own firm from nothing, who'd watched me pull permits and do my own books and negotiate my own contracts, and one afternoon she said, "You've got the instinct. Most people who inherit it don't have it. You weren't given it, so you learned it, and that's better." And when the bank needed a co-signer, Ruth looked at my file, and she looked at me, and she signed. A near stranger did what my own brother wouldn't. I have never forgotten it. Ruth became my mentor, my compass, the person who taught me how the big money actually moves in a town like Wexford. Not luck. Ruth was never luck. She was competence, recognizing competence. The fourth choice was the strip mall. By then, we were the Reyes family, and we had a small company and a reputation for taking distressed property and making it breathe. And a little commercial strip on the county road came up, half empty. The owner in trouble, the price distressed. 6 units. A laundromat, a taqueria, 3 vacancies, and a nail salon that always paid late. Everybody told us it was a bad buy. Ruth ran the numbers with me for a week. And then she tapped the sheet and she said, "It's not a bad buy. It's a scary buy. Those aren't the same thing. You've been trained your whole life to think scared means wrong. It doesn't. It means most people won't do it. That's where the money is." We bought the strip mall. It was the first thing we ever owned that other people paid us rent to use. And I will not lie to you, the first month a rent check cleared into our account, I sat in our little office and I cried. Because I finally understood something about my family that I'd never let myself think all the way through. My father sat in a beautiful office, in a building full of people paying to be there. Rent, leases, that was the real machine under the store. Not the perfume counter, the paper. And I had just, for the first time, gotten on the other side of it. I owned the ground. Other people paid me to stand on it. I didn't know yet how far that thought would carry me, but it had teeth in it, and it had gotten into me, and it would not let go. Now I have to tell you about the winter that almost took all of it back. Because I don't want you to think the climb was clean. It wasn't. This is where we nearly lost everything, and if you've ever built something and watched it start to come apart in your hands, you already know the specific cold I'm about to describe. It was our 5th year building, maybe our 6th. We'd gotten bigger. Too big, maybe, a little too fast. We had the strip mall and 2 apartment buildings, and debt against all of it. Good debt. The kind you're supposed to carry, but a lot of it. And that winter, 3 things went wrong at once. The way they always do. Our biggest tenant defaulted. The taqueria's owner, a decent man, just couldn't make it, and he walked, and 2 other units in the strip went empty the same season. And suddenly, that scary buy was bleeding us every single month. Then the bank that held the notes got nervous about the vacancy and started making noise about our loan terms. And a nervous bank is a dangerous animal. And then, because the world has no sense of timing, the furnace in one of our apartment buildings died in January. A full replacement. Thousands of dollars we did not have. In the coldest week of the year. There's a symmetry there I didn't miss even then. A dead furnace in the cold. That's where it started, Mateo and me. And now a dead furnace in the cold was going to be the thing that broke us. We sat at the kitchen table, the one he'd built, and we looked at the numbers. And the numbers said we might have to sell everything. All of it. The strip, the buildings, the company. Go back to zero. And I looked across that table at my husband, and I watched a thought move across his face. And I knew what it was before he said it, because I'd been dreading it for weeks. He said, "I'll go back on the tools." You have to understand what that cost him to say. He'd built a company. He was a licensed contractor now. He ran crews. He'd made himself into exactly the man my father said he could never be. And he was offering to go back to being the 23-year-old who crawls under other people's furnaces, taking night jobs and weekend jobs and emergency calls, freezing in strangers' basements at 2 in the morning so that we could keep the thing we'd built, so that I wouldn't lose it. I said no at first. I said we'd sell before I let him do that. And he took my hand across the table, the same way he had on our wedding night, and he said, "Nora, I made you a promise. I'm not breaking it because one winter got hard. Building it means building it when it's hard, especially when it's hard." And so he went back on the tools. For a whole winter, my husband ran his company by day and fixed furnaces by night. And I found new tenants and begged the bank for 90 more days and did the math over and over at that kitchen table until the numbers, finally, by March, turned. We held. Barely. We didn't sell a single thing. When the spring came and the taqueria unit filled and the bank went quiet, I sat in that office and I did not cry this time. I was too tired to cry. But I looked at everything we still owned, everything we'd nearly lost and hadn't, and I felt something harden in me that had been soft my whole life. I understood, finally in my bones, what my grandfather meant about hands. We had held it with our hands. Nobody had signed it for us. Nobody had saved us. We'd saved it ourselves, in the cold, and that meant it was ours, in a way that nothing my family ever owned was truly theirs. And that spring, when we were still catching our breath, still counting ourselves lucky to have survived, a name came across Ruth Okafor's desk that would change my entire life. A name I hadn't thought about in years. A name attached to a piece of downtown Wexford I knew better than I knew my own hands. Walt Coburn had died. Ruth called me on a Tuesday. She said, "Nora, an estate just came up quiet before it hits the market. Old man named Coburn. He owned a whole downtown block and never told a soul how much he was sitting on." And she started reading me the addresses on that block. And I was only half listening, tired, thinking about a tenant, until she read the 3rd address. And I stopped. And I made her read it again. Because the 3rd address on Walt Coburn's block was the corner of Main and 3rd. 4 stories of brick and brass. The store my grandfather built. The store my name was struck from. The building my family had leased since 1984 and always meant to buy back, and never did. And somewhere far back in my memory, a flustered old bookkeeper's voice came up out of the dark. A sentence I'd thrown away on the worst day of my life. Your family doesn't even own it. Sold it in '84, always meaning to buy it back. Never did. I sat very still with the phone against my ear, and for the first time in 10 years, I thought about the drawer in my house, where a card still sat with one word on it, in my father's hand. Ruth, I said. How much do they want for the block? Ruth said a number into the phone, 1.4 million for the whole block. She said it the way she said all numbers, flat, like weather, and I wrote it on the back of an envelope with a pencil that needed sharpening, and I looked at it for a long time. I did not think about revenge. I want you to know that. I have told this story enough times now to know that people want me to say I sat there and plotted. I didn't. What I felt was quieter than that, and older. I felt the way you feel when a door you thought was painted shut turns out to have been unlocked the whole time. Nora, Ruth said, you still there? I'm here. You know this building. I know this building better than the man who's selling it. She was quiet a moment. Ruth never wasted words. Then she said, the estate wants it clean and quiet. No brokers walking a parade through the lobby. Cash close, 30 days. Can you and Mateo carry it? I looked around my kitchen. Mateo built that table. I looked at the deed folder on the counter for the strip mall we had bled through the winter to keep. I looked at 10 years of my life stacked in a plastic file box by the door. We can carry it, I said, but I want to do it a certain way. Tell me. I don't want the name on anything, not mine, not the store's. I want a new company, something nobody can trace back to me across a table. Ruth was quiet again. Then she laughed, low, one breath. You've been waiting 10 years to say that. No, I said, and I meant it. I've been building for 10 years. I just now noticed what I built. We filed the offer under Reyes Coburn Properties, LLC, Mateo's name and mine, folded together riding on a dead man's block. Walt Coburn had been kind to me once, years ago, before all of it, a friend of the family who used to slip me a peppermint at the counter. He never knew he'd hand me my whole life on his way out of the world. That's how it goes sometimes. The gift comes from the person you least expect, long after the people who owed you have closed their fists. We signed on a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because everything that ever mattered in my life seemed to land on a Tuesday, and here was one more. We sat in a title office with fluorescent light and bad coffee, and a woman who didn't know us from anyone. And I put my pen to the line and I wrote Nora Reyes. And I bought the building my grandfather built, and my father sold, and my family had leased for 40 years and always meant to buy back. Nobody clapped. Nobody knew. That was the whole point. The purchase closed at $1.4 million. When the deed recorded, the store on the corner of Main and 3rd began paying rent to me, $1,200 a month. Every first of the month, a check made out to a company name my father had never heard, drawn on the account of the store that bore his, signed by a clerk who had no idea she was mailing my family's money to the daughter they threw away. I did not tell them. I want you to sit with how strange that is. I had every reason in the world to walk into that lobby, past the brass plaque, with the empty space where my name used to be, and say it. I had rehearsed that walk in my mind for 10 years, and when I finally could have taken it, I found I didn't want to. Not yet. There was something cleaner in the silence, something my grandfather would have understood, about hands, about holding a thing quietly until it's truly yours. For 3 years I was my family's landlord, and they never knew. 3 years is a long time to keep a secret that big. But I had practice. I had kept the secret of my own worth for a decade, hadn't I? This was easier. This one had a deed behind it. The night the deed recorded, I did something I hadn't done in 10 years. I opened the drawer in my house, the bottom one in the small desk by the window, where I kept the things I couldn't throw out and couldn't look at. and I took out a cream-colored card. My wedding invitation, the one my father mailed back to me. And across the front of it, in his own hand, in the blue ink of the fountain pen he thought made him look like his father. One word. Declined. I read it once. Just once. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried the day it came, and I didn't cry now. I looked at that word, and then I looked at the deed folder on my kitchen table, thick and official, and mine. And I slid the card inside it, right there against the paper that said the building was ours. Let them keep each other company, I thought. The word that cut me, and the deed that answered it. Mateo came and stood behind me. He put his hand on my shoulder, the same rough hand that fixed the store's boiler the summer we met, the hand my mother called dirty at a dinner table in front of 40 people. "You okay?" he said. "I'm okay. You want to tell them?" "No," I said. "I want to wait." "For what?" I didn't have the words for it then. I do now. I was waiting for the thing you can't manufacture and can't rush. I was waiting for them to need me. Because a revelation you force is just a tantrum. But a revelation the other person walks into on their own 2 feet, asking, hat in hand, that's justice. That's the kind that lasts. So I waited, and while I waited, I watched. You can learn a great deal about a family from the far side of a ledger. I saw things I was never meant to see. I saw the store's numbers the way a landlord sees them, in the rent that came a day late one month, then 2 days late the next. Small things. Cracks you'd miss if you weren't the one holding the wall. And I heard things, the way you hear things in a town like Wexford, where everyone's cousin works at everyone's bank. I heard that Preston, my golden brother, the one who wouldn't co-sign a loan for his own sister, had opened a second store across the county line. Leveraged to the ceiling to do it, borrowed against the flagship to build a shrine to himself 20 miles away. He'd learned the front of the business, the smiling and the shaking of hands. He never learned the back of it, the part that keeps you alive in a bad winter. I knew that part. I'd learned it in the cold, the year we almost lost everything. Preston learned it the expensive way, all at once, and too late. I heard the family let the buyback option lapse. Again, there was a clause, buried in that old lease, a right of first refusal, a chance to purchase the building on a schedule. It had come around before, and they'd waved it off. It came around again now, and some assistant in some office marked it declined and moved on. Because who buys the building you've leased forever? And besides, the landlord was just some faceless company, some LLC. A formality, a name on an envelope. My father never even read it. Why would he? He was Gerald Ashford. Buildings were things that belonged to people like him, by right of being who he was. That's the arrogance that beat him. Not my cleverness. His certainty. He signed a long lease and treated it like a napkin. He equated the name on the door with the deed in the vault. And they were never the same thing. And he never once thought to check. Then the ground moved under all of them. And it wasn't me who moved it. The retail downturn came the way weather comes, from a long way off and then all at once. Department stores everywhere started to hollow out. Foot traffic thinned. Preston's second location, the one he'd borrowed the flagship's own value to build, started bleeding from the day it opened. And the flagship, the mother store, the 4 stories of brick and brass on the corner of Main and 3rd. The store my grandfather built with his hands and his name came up on the last stretch of its 10-year lease. 60 days. The lease had 60 days to run. And to keep the store where it had stood for a lifetime, they needed one thing. They needed the landlord's signature. They needed my signature. I got the call from Preston's assistant. A young woman, polite, harried, reading from a script. She did not know who I was. She was calling Reyes Coburn Properties to request a meeting about a lease renewal for a valued long-term tenant. Could Mrs. Reyes make time? Mrs. Reyes could. I set it for a Tuesday. I did not tell Ruth what I was going to do. I did not have to. She came by my office that morning anyway, and she looked at me across the desk, and she said, "You know they're walking in here blind." "I know. You could tell them ahead. Give them a chance to send a lawyer. Keep it clean." "Ruth," I said, "for 10 years they never once gave me a chance to keep anything clean. They took it in front of 40 people. They mailed my key back with no note. They put a line through my name in a book. I folded my hands on the desk. I am not going to humiliate them. I'm going to sit here and let them see who owns the floor they're standing on. That's not cruelty. That's just the truth arriving on time." She held my eyes a long moment. Then she nodded once, the way she nodded at a number that came out right. "Okay," she said. "I'll be down the hall. They came at 10 in the morning." I heard them before I saw them. My father's voice in the outer office. That voice, the one that filled the Christmas floor of the store when I was a girl, telling the receptionist who he was, as if the name would open the door faster. Gerald Ashford, of Ashford and Vale, here to see the landlord. And then the door opened, and my father and my brother walked into my office. I want to tell you exactly what that room looked like, because I had 10 years to imagine it, and it was nothing like I imagined, and better than I imagined all at once. A long table. Not mahogany like the one in the store's boardroom where they used to decide my future without me. Just good, honest oak. Mateo had helped me pick it. On the table, two things, side by side, squared to the edge. A letter. And a small cream-colored card. My father was older than the picture I carried of him. That surprised me. In my mind, he'd stayed the man from the engagement dinner, tall and certain, delivering his line about furnaces to a room of nodding relatives. The man who walked in was thinner. His hair had gone fully white. But he still came through a door like he owned it, and he still looked at the woman behind the desk with the mild, dismissive courtesy he showed to people he considered staff. He didn't know me. For 3 full seconds, my own father looked at my face and did not know me. Then Preston did. Preston stopped just inside the door. All the color went out of his face at once, like a tap turned off. "Dad," he said, very quietly. "Dad." Wait, Gerald had already put his hand out, already started his practice greeting. "Mrs. Reyes, I appreciate you making time. I think we can be brief. We've been model tenants for." And then something in Preston's voice reached him, and he turned to look at his son, and then he turned back to me. And he really looked. And I watched it happen. I watched my father's face fall through 40 years in about 2 seconds. "Hello, Dad," I said. The room froze. That's the only word for it. It froze the way a pond freezes, all at once at the surface, everything under it still moving in the dark. Gerald's hand was still half out. He drew it back slowly. He looked at the nameplate on my desk, the one I'd set out that morning for exactly this, and he read it, and I watched his lips move. Reyes Coburn Properties. "Nora Reyes, principal, sit down," I said, not unkindly. "Please, you came about the lease." "Let's talk about the lease." Preston sat because his legs did it for him. He half fell into the chair. My father stayed standing a moment longer, one hand on the back of the chair, and I let him. I'd stood a long time once, too, at a dinner, while he stayed seated. I knew what it cost a body to keep standing when the ground is gone. Then, he sat. "How long?" he said. His voice wasn't the store voice anymore. "How long have you?" 3 years, I said. "I've owned the building 3 years. I've owned your store's roof and floor and those 4 walls for 3 years. And you've been paying me $1,200 a month. And you never knew. Because you never once thought to read the name on the check." "The Coburn estate," he said slowly. "The block? I bought it. 1.4 million, cash, 30 days. Walt Coburn's block, including the corner of Main and 3rd. I let that sit. The building your father built with his hands. The building you sold in 1984 and leased back, and always meant to buy again and never did. I bought it back. Not the family. Me, the one you cut off." Preston was staring at the table. and I watched him start to do the thing I knew he'd do. Because I knew him. Because he was raised to think in front of house numbers, and I'd been raised in the same house and taught myself the back. I watched my brother do the math. The flagship carries the chain, he said, almost to himself. If we lose the flagship lease, the second store can't. The second store was leveraged against the flagship. The flagship covers the note. If the flagship, and he stopped. He stopped mid-sentence, the way you stop when your foot finds the edge of a stair that isn't there. He looked up at me, and his mouth stayed open, and nothing else came out. "Finish it, Preston," I said. "Gently. You're almost there." He didn't finish it. He didn't have to. We all heard the number the sentence was walking toward. My father found his voice. And here is the thing about Gerald Ashford. Even then, even in that chair, in that room, with the floor gone, the first thing he reached for was not an apology. It was leverage. It was the old certainty, dressed up for a new room. "Nora," he said, "whatever happened between us, this is business. You're a businesswoman now, I can see that. So let's talk like business people. We've been in that building for decades. We'll sign a new 10-year lease today. We'll pay a premium. Name a fair number. You'll have a AAA tenant locked in for a decade. That's good for you. That's the smart move for everyone." He actually smiled at me, the store smile. And for one moment I almost admired it, the sheer refusal of the man to bend, even as he fell. I reached out and I turned the letter on the table around, so it faced him, and I slid it across the oak. "Read the top of it," I said. He looked down. He read the letterhead. Reyes Coburn Properties. I watched him read the first line under it. "Notice of non-renewal of commercial lease." "I'm not offering you a new lease, Dad," I said. "I'm declining to renew the old one. Lawfully, on schedule. You have 60 days. You'll be out of the building your father built by the 1st of the month, and the store on the corner of Main and 3rd will be a store your family used to have." And then, I did the last thing. The thing I'd carried in a drawer for 10 years, and in a deed folder for 3. I picked up the small cream card from where it sat beside the letter, and I laid it down again on top of the letter, face up, so my father could see his own handwriting. Declined, in his own blue ink, in his own hand. He knew it instantly. Of course he did. A man knows his own pen. His face, which had held through the whole revelation, held through the deed and the money and the 60 days, finally broke on that little card. Because the deed was business, and a man like my father can lose at business and tell himself a story about it. But the card was the truth of what he'd done to his own daughter, small and petty and permanent, and it had come all the way back across 10 years to lie on a table between us, and there was no story to tell about it. "You said I'd be nothing without the Ashford name," I said. "Quiet, dry, no heat in it at all, because it didn't need any. You said no Ashford marries a man who crawls under other people's furnaces. And then you struck my name out of your book." I looked at him. "The deed says Reyes. That name got me the whole building. Yours got you 60 days. Nobody said anything for a while." Preston had his hand over his mouth. My father sat and looked at the card, and I let him. I did not gloat. I promise you I did not gloat. I had waited 10 years precisely so that I would not have to. The facts did all the work. That's what the waiting had bought me. A room where I didn't have to raise my voice, because the truth was finally loud enough on its own. Then Gerald stood. He didn't say goodbye. He couldn't. He walked out of my office the way a man walks out of a room where something has ended, careful with his feet. Preston stood too, and at the door he stopped and looked back at me, and for a second I saw the boy he'd been, before the store made him, and he opened his mouth, and then he closed it, and he followed our father out. I sat alone in the quiet after, and Ruth came down the hall and stood in the doorway and looked at the two things still lying on the table, the letter and the card. And she didn't say anything. She just came in and sat down across from me, in the chair where my father had sat, and she poured us both coffee from the pot on the sideboard, and we drank it. That's all. Two women who'd built something with their hands, drinking coffee in the quiet on a Tuesday. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. There was one more scene left, and it was the one I'd been waiting for without knowing it. Because I told you a revelation you force is a tantrum, but a revelation the other person walks into asking is justice. I'd given them the first part. Now they had to come back and ask. They came back 3 weeks later. Not Preston. Preston was gone by then, sunk under the second store, working out a bankruptcy I heard about the way I heard about everything, sideways through the town. It was my father who came back. Gerald Ashford at my office door in the middle of a Wednesday, with no appointment, holding his hat in his hands. I want you to understand what that cost him. This was a man who had never asked for anything in his life, who believed the world owed him standing the way it owed the sun its rising, and he stood in my doorway with his hat literally in his two hands. An old man now, and he asked. "Nora," he said, "please, I'm not here for me. I'm here for the store. Your grandfather's store. 60 years on that corner. Give us the extension. Any terms. I'll sign anything." And here is where you expect me to close the door in his face. I didn't. Because I meant what I said. I am not cruel. And I loved that store once. Truly, the brass and the wood and the Christmas floor, before it became the thing they used to measure my worth. So I told him the truth of what I would do, and I made it fair, and I made it humane, and I set the price in grace, and not in blood. "Sit down," I said, and he sat. "I'll give you a lease," I said, "a real one, fair market. 10 years if you want it. On one condition. Name it. Every hourly worker keeps their job, every one. The cashiers, the stockroom, the woman who's run the gift wrap counter since I was a child, the maintenance men, all of them, on payroll, at their wages. Guaranteed in writing for the full term. You keep your people. That's the price. Not $1 more in rent than any fair tenant would pay. Just that. Keep the people who built the place standing." I thought it was mercy. I meant it as mercy. It was the easiest condition in the world for a man who cared about anything more than himself. He couldn't do it. I watched him try. I watched my father sit in that chair and turn it over, and I watched him arrive at the thing that had always been true about him, the thing that disinherited me and would now empty his own store. He wanted to close the underperforming departments, cut the payroll to save the margin, keep the name on the door, and let the people who wore it go. And my condition wouldn't let him. My condition made him choose between his people and his pride. He chose his pride. Of course he did. It was the only thing he'd never once failed to choose. "That's not a serious business condition," he said, and the store voice came back into him. Thin now, but there. "You're tying my hands. No operator would sign that." "Then don't sign it," I said, and I stood, and I walked to the door, and I opened it. And I held it open for him. Not slammed. Held a dignified way out, offered with two open hands. "The door's open, Dad. It's been open the whole time. It's you who won't walk through it." He looked at me for a long moment. And I think, at the very end, some small true thing moved behind his eyes. Some understanding of what he'd traded, and what he'd lost, and how completely it had been his own doing, start to finish. But it didn't reach his hands. It never had. He put his hat back on his head, and he stood, and he walked out of my office, and out of the store, and out of the last thing his father built. The brass letters came down off the front of the building on a Thursday. I went to watch, not to gloat. I've told you I didn't gloat, and I'll tell you again, because it matters. I went because I'd spent my girlhood under those letters, and I wanted to see them come down with my own eyes, the way you go to a funeral for something that was once alive to you. A crew took them down one at a time. The big brass A of Ashford, the ampersand, the letters of Vale, unbolting 60 years off a wall. And the sidewalk filled up. The way sidewalks do in a town like Wexford. Neighbors, shopkeepers, and the store's own people. The hourly ones, the cashiers and the stockroom crew, and the woman from the gift wrap counter, standing on the sidewalk watching their store come apart, because my father would not keep them on to save it. I hired every one of them. Right there, most of them. I had a new tenant coming into the ground floor, a community grocer, and a trade school going into the upper floors. The kind of trade school that teaches the work Mateo did, the work my mother called dirty, the honest work of hands. And they needed people who knew the building, who knew the town, who knew how to run a floor. So I took the people my father threw away, the same way I'd once been thrown away, and I gave them somewhere to stand. I only said one thing that day. The woman from the gift wrap counter, who'd slipped me ribbon scraps when I was 6, came up to me on the sidewalk with tears in her eyes and asked me why. Why I'd saved them when the family wouldn't. Because somebody should have caught me, I said, and nobody did. So, that was all. So, the whole thing in one small word. 1 year later, I'm on the porch of a house my husband rebuilt with his own hands. It's morning. The light comes in low and gold across a kitchen table Mateo built, and I've got coffee. And the house is quiet in the good way. The way a thing is quiet when it's finally yours and nobody can send back the key. The building on the corner of Main and 3rd is full again. There's a grocer on the ground floor where the perfume counter used to be. And above it, in the rooms where they once decided my future without me, there are young people learning to wire a panel and braze a joint and read a blueprint. I funded the school. It's got a plain name. It doesn't have Ashford on it, or Reyes either. It just says trade. That felt right. You want to know what became of them? I'll give you each one, dry, the way my grandfather would have, and then I'll let them rest. Gerald's chain shrank down to the one store, the second one, the county line shrine to Preston's ambition, and it limps along under a different manager now because Preston couldn't keep it. My father is an old man in a small store trying to remember when he was a large man in a large one. Vivian, my mother, the one who mailed my key back with no note, who called my husband's hands dirty across a table of 40 people, calls me now. Sometimes, my phone knows her number and lets it ring. I don't hate her. Hate takes more of you than she's worth. I just don't answer. She architected a family with no room in it for me, and she got the family she built. And I'm not in it, exactly as she wanted, and I've made peace with giving her precisely what she asked for. Preston works for someone else now, runs a floor in a store 2 towns over, wears a badge with his own name on it, and reports to a man half his age. I hear he's good at it. He always was good at the front of house. I don't wish him ill. I sent word, once, through the town, that if he ever wanted honest work there was a place at the trade school for a man who knew retail. He hasn't come. Pride, I expect. It runs in the family. It ran in me too once, the pride that kept asking to be let back in. I set mine down a long time ago. I hope he sets his down before he's as old as our father. And on the wall of the house Mateo built, there's a frame, a small one. Inside it, a cream-colored card, and one word across it, in blue ink, in a dead certainty's hand. Declined, I framed it the day it came back to me, 10 years ago, when I still thought I'd have to earn my way back to people who'd never opened the door. I kept it framed all through the building, and I keep it framed now, but it means something different than it used to. It used to be a wound I refused to hide. Now it's just the truth of where I started. A father wrote one word to make me nothing, and I made that word the first line of everything I own. I don't resent it anymore. I don't even feel the old ache when I pass it. It's just a card on a wall in a house that's paid for, next to a window that looks out on a town where I own the corner my grandfather built. Mateo came out onto the porch this morning while I was writing the end of this in my head. He sat down next to me with his own coffee, in the chair he made, and he didn't say anything for a while. Because we've been married long enough that most of what we say to each other we say without words now. On our wedding night, 10 years ago, in a rented room with nothing to our name, he made me a promise. He said, "I'll build you something they can't take." And I remember I smiled at him. Because I loved him and because I didn't quite believe him. Because I was still 18 inside where it counted, still half sure that the people who threw me away had been right about my worth. He never mentioned that promise again. Not once in 10 years. This morning, on the porch, looking out at the building we own and the school we built, and the life no one can send back Mark declined, he lifted his coffee an inch off his knee, toward the corner of Main and 3rd, and he said, "Quiet, you watched me." And I did. That's the thing. He told me to watch him, and I did, for 10 years, and he built it, exactly like he said, out of his 2 rough hands and my 2 stubborn ones, and now it's ours, held with our hands, the way my grandfather meant. I don't have a grand ending for you. Just a porch, and the light on a table a good man built, and a card on a wall that used to be a wound and is now just a beginning. The name my family refused me, I made worth more than the one they kept. That's the whole story. That's all it ever was. If anyone ever told you you'd be nothing without them, I hope this one found you at the right time. Tell me the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels.